show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience.
On the 21st of July of this year, my mom passed away. She was 85 years old. The funeral was a week later, and I want to share with you what I shared on that occasion. And here's why. In a letter she left us with some details for her funeral, she made this statement: I want to let my little light, and she used the double diminutive, shine one last time. Just days before her death, she wanted all her brothers and sisters to come together because, so she said, I have something to say. At that moment, I suspect it was clear to her what that something was, but the next day, when everyone was there, her communication was not clear. I have a hunch about what was on her mind, but she could not verbalize it. And afterwards, she regretted that she had not been able to give, as she called it, her little testimony. Notice the repetition. There was nothing big or spectacular about the life of my mother, except for the outstanding quality of the ordinary. She couldn't say it. Therefore, I'm going to speak for her. I want to let her little light shine just a little bit further than she managed. So here's what I said during her funeral service. Someone, I don't remember who, once asked, what language does God speak? And he answered the question as follows: people are the language of God. You could think about each person as a word, or a sentence, or a story, because in the end, every life is a story. And all together, these lives tell the big story that God wants to tell. So you might ask, what is someone's story? What sentence is or was this person? What word? When I thought about it like this, I knew quickly which word I connect with my mother. I'm not going to try to tell her whole story. A lot of it I don't know. I wasn't there for the first 24 years. I only have second and third hand knowledge about that. I'm not going to summarize her life story, but that word, that's what I want to talk about. It's a Hebrew word, chesed. I use a Hebrew word because it's so rich and because it combines two ideas. It's difficult to translate, doesn't fit into one English word. You need two words for it. English translations commonly speak of loving kindness, steadfast love, or covenant faithfulness. Because chesed is a combination of those two ideas, love and faithfulness. And those who knew my mother will understand why I find this word so fitting. Faithful love, that's how she lived, until the very end, when in fact she was no longer able to do much anymore. An indication of this in her is how long some relationships of my parents have existed. The first neighbors from their first flat in her fleet, more than 60 years ago, for example, neighbors and acquaintances from other locations where they have lived. Of course, some of these friends and acquaintances are no longer alive. Others are so old that they could not be present at the funeral, but the relationship remained to the end, as has sometimes passed on to the children, who write to us now that they still remember what it was like visiting my mother, sometimes decades ago. And I also think of the time long ago when my mother did elderly visits for the church. Some elderly people she accompanied for many years, and they were not always easy people. Some years ago we were in Brille together, and she insisted on going to the cemetery there to visit and clean up the graves of two of those elderly people from the past. Because nobody else cares, she said. But she did. That's faithful love, chesed. One might ask, and what did she get for it? Where was the answer, the reward? Where was God's faithful love for the past 8 or 9 years? A tenth of her life? Because my mother's health began to decline even before my father fell sick, and that's more than 8 years ago. And then there was the illness in her childhood that left her with leaky heart valves, a lifelong disability. There was no faith bonus for her. God did not make it any easier because she had faith. I don't know if my mother asked herself questions like these, consciously or even critically, but I would understand if she did. The last gift Francisca and I gave my mother was a book. And the book by Henry Nouwen is about the parable of the prodigal son, a well-known story from the Bible. The youngest of two sons claims his inheritance while his father is still alive. He sells everything, goes to a distant land where he squanders everything and while living. Luke 15. The book is also about the painting Rembrandt made of this parable at the end of his life. And those who know Rembrandt's life know that he was somewhat like the prodigal son, while living, ending in poverty. Of course, in reality, both the parable and the painting are not only about the youngest, the prodigal son, but also about the father and the elder son, who is no less lost. There he stands, at the edge of the painting. His attitude says, "All my life I worked hard, was faithful, did everything you wanted, but for that son of yours, you let the fattened calf be slaughtered." Understandable, that anger. And the father says to him, Luke 15 verse 31, "Child, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours." Really? I don't know how well my mother understood that, whether she could really see herself as the beloved daughter. I'm not sure I understand that either. Who among us has really understood that God is like the Father in this parable? "Child, you are with me always, and all that is mine is yours." One striking aspect of Rembrandt's painting is how he painted the father. I don't know how you've imagined this father, perhaps as a pater familias, a strong man, at the very least head of the family, an authority. Not so with Rembrandt. The father is old, looks fragile, frail, is almost blind. Fragile, brittle, so did my mother become. She never looked more beautiful, I think, than in those last months, when she couldn't do much anymore. Less and less. An emaciated body with a spirit that still flared up again and again, especially when there were visitors. But with questions. Why is it taking so long? Who will help me into heaven? Why does the door stay closed? Yes, where was the answer to her faithful love? Where was God's chesed? I think it came through us who were with her. When she could no longer give faithful love, it was our turn. And that started with patience. Patiently waiting for her to say what she wanted, or to do what she said, for her to do what she said she was going to do. It took time, a lot of time, more and more time. God's love came through the doctor, who in the end came by every day, home care that helped her so patiently and lovingly. And so this too is part of my mother's message. An invitation. Faithful love, just do it. It's not about what we get in return. It's about becoming like the father of the prodigal son, of the prodigal sons, both the beloved sons and the father of the beloved daughter. Again, I don't know if my mother could really see herself that way, as the beloved daughter. Perhaps for her God was still too much the stern father you are afraid of. But in reality, she was the beloved daughter. One of her last nights, my sister and I sat with her on the bed because she wanted to show and explain her jewelry to us. Now, their value was in the memories, the relationships behind them, more than in terms of money. And she had a simple bracelet with a small porcelain motif in Delftware, very Dutch, a windmill in Delft's blue. And she said, "This was given to me by my parents when I turned 15, and they couldn't actually afford it." Now I calculate quickly, 15, That's 1952. Shortly after the war, a large family. No, indeed, my grandparents couldn't afford that. I think, Mom, do you hear that? God's language. He speaks through people. He'll let you know, even then, that you are my beloved daughter. That last stretch of her life was not easy. And that's why I believe that at the end of her life there's one more message. 2 words. And yet. This was not an easy ending. And yet. Despite the questions and doubts that were also there increasingly toward the end. And yet. It was no strong, no triumphalist and yet. But yet. At the end of her life stood, I know that my Redeemer lives. And in that faith my mother died. When the Apostle Paul stood at the end of his life, he could say, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. 2 Timothy 4 verse 7 and 8. The crown of glory. And my mother couldn't say it like that. You don't say that about yourself. That's why I say it. She has finished the race. Now it's time for the crown of glory. Well done, Mom. Thank you, farewell, and until we meet again. And for those of us who remain, let's remember her message, the word, chesed, and yet.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience.